Beneath the roars of the Colosseum, beneath the blood-soaked sand, there existed another arena, one unseen by the cheering crowds, where screams were silenced, dignity was auctioned, and survival came at a cost far worse than death. This is not the story of glory, but of the forgotten. Women who entered Rome's most brutal spectacle not as spectators, but as spoils. Their stories were erased from marble, yet their suffering echoes through the centuries. What if the greatest symbol of civilization was built on the screams of the forgotten? The Colosseum, Rome's beating heart, its crown of glory. To the roaring crowd above, it was the stage of heroes and divine spectacle. Golden sunlight danced upon the marble arches as emperors, nobles, and commoners alike cheered in one voice, a chorus that celebrated blood as entertainment. But beneath that magnificent stage, the air was different. It was heavy, damp, choked with the stench of fear and decay. The Hippodrome, a labyrinth of tunnels, chains, and shadow, pulsed like the Empire's hidden heart. Every rumble from the cheering above trembled through the stone below, where hundreds waited for their turn to die, or to serve. There were cages filled with beasts, lions from Numidia, leopards from Egypt, bears from Gaul, all pacing restlessly in the dark, and among them, caged too, were the conquered women of Rome's wars, Parthian captives, Celtic daughters, Greek slaves, stripped of name, home, and humanity. Their fate was not recorded in marble inscriptions or history scrolls, because history only remembers those who entertained it. Above, Rome worshipped power. Below, power fed on the weak. The audience demanded wonder. The empire supplied it, in blood, in screams, and in silence. What happens when conquest doesn't end on the battlefield but follows its captives into eternity? Far beyond the Colosseum's reach, in villages scorched by Roman fire, soldiers dragged away their spoils: gold, cattle, and women. The empire's legions were not just conquerors, they were harvesters of flesh. From Britannia's cold forests to Judea's burning deserts, thousands of women were bound in chains and herded like animals toward Rome, a journey that could last months. Those too weak to continue were discarded by the roadside. Those who survived became merchandise. In bustling slave markets, the exotic and defiant fetched the highest price. Roman buyers examined them like livestock, checking teeth, hair, scars, bargaining over the value of beauty and despair. Some were sold to noblemen, some to brothels, and some were purchased for the games. These women were never meant to see sunlight again. To the Romans, they were part of the entertainment economy, nameless tools of spectacle. Some were used to lure animals into the arena, others to motivate gladiators in grim pre-fight rituals. And yet among them whispers spread, of one woman who bit off her own tongue rather than let her captors hear her scream, of another who carved the name of her homeland into her skin before death, so her body would never belong to Rome. They were not remembered as heroes, but their defiance, however small, was the last rebellion the empire could not erase. If Rome's greatness was a stage, who cleaned the blood after the applause? Down beneath the wooden floors of the Colosseum, the Hypogeum was alive with motion. Slaves hauling corpses, guards shouting orders, torches crackling in the damp air. Rats scurried between pools of blood. The smell of death never left. Captive women were held in narrow stone cells. No windows, no warmth, only the echo of screams through the corridors. They weren't killed immediately. Some were kept for rituals, others as companions for victorious gladiators, a reward disguised as mercy. They washed the blood from their bodies with the same water used to clean the arena's sand. They whispered prayers into the cracks of the walls, hoping the gods had not yet abandoned them, and when the drums thundered above, the signal that a fight was about to begin, their hearts froze. Because for some, it meant release through death. For others, it meant another night alive, in a world that no longer recognized them as human. The crowd never saw them. The empire never spoke of them. But beneath every drop of sand in that arena, their memory lies buried, silent witnesses to Rome's glorious cruelty. What is the price of a human soul when an empire decides it can be bought? Rome's markets were not just places of commerce, they were theatres of humiliation. Beneath fluttering banners and marble statues, captives were displayed like trophies from distant wars. The clang of chains replaced laughter. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the square, describing flesh as if it were fine wine. Strong back, fair skin, foreign tongue, suitable for pleasure or spectacle. The crowd nodded, assessing, bidding. Coins flashed like tiny suns, bright, cold, final. Each clang of silver sealed a life's destiny. The most desired were not always the strongest, but the most interesting. Women with unusual eyes, hair of rare colour, scars that told stories, all fetched higher prices. The Romans found beauty in suffering, fascination in fear. Those who resisted were marked as spirited stock, often reserved for the games or for gladiators seeking post-battle spoils. Behind closed doors, senators and nobles held private selections, where the screams were muffled and the bidding never stopped. For the powerful, buying a captive woman was not merely indulgence, it was a declaration of dominance, a public display of wealth measured in human despair. When the final bids were placed, chains rattled once more. The women, branded and broken, were led away, some to the brothels, some to the villas, and some directly to the Colosseum's underground tunnels. For them, Rome was not a city of gods. It was a marketplace of suffering, where beauty itself became a curse. Can a man still be a slave when he holds the power to enslave another? Gladiators were Rome's paradox, adored by the crowd yet owned by the empire. They were tools of death and glory, property with fame, and as their reward for survival, the empire offered them what it took from others: control. After the games, victorious gladiators were often given companions, women from the captive pens below the Colosseum. To the public it was framed as celebration. In truth, it was another layer of Rome's cruelty, the empire teaching its slaves to become masters of pain. Some gladiators refused, haunted by what they'd become. Others accepted, numbed by years of blood and loss. And a few embraced the power. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred beneath the flicker of torchlight. In the dim cells, these women were forced into a mockery of companionship. They were told it was honour, that serving a champion was better than dying. Yet for many, death was mercy denied. Roman poets later romanticized these encounters, stories of gladiators falling in love with their gifts. But love cannot exist where freedom does not. The empire turned intimacy into spectacle, affection into ownership, and so, even in their moments of victory, the gladiators remained chained, not to the empire this time, but to their own reflection in the eyes of the broken. What does mercy mean when offered by a monster? For the captives, hope was a weapon sharper than any sword. The Romans understood this. They wielded it carefully, promising freedom, comfort, or protection, only to twist it into deeper torment. A woman who pleased her master might be told she could earn her release, but such promises were myths, dangled like stars above an unreachable sky. Years passed, generations forgotten, yet none were truly freed. Even those who survived the Colosseum's shadow were marked, forever belonging to Rome. The worst punishment was not pain, but waiting, the endless uncertainty of whether one's suffering would end tonight or never. Some women went mad speaking to ghosts of those already gone. Others grew silent, hollowed out by despair so complete that even fear abandoned them. And above it all, the empire continued to cheer. To Rome, these women were invisible threads holding together its grand illusion of glory. Their torment was the mortar between the stones of its greatness, and in the end their tears became part of the sand, washed away with every new spectacle. Because in Rome, mercy was not the absence of cruelty, it was its cruelest disguise. When the arena fell silent and the last body was dragged away, what did victory truly mean? As the sun dipped behind Rome's towering arches, the Colosseum changed its mask. The sand was raked, the corpses cleared, and the empire's favourite sons, the gladiators, were led through marble corridors into another kind of stage. There, victory was no longer measured in blood, but in indulgence. The emperors and nobles who watched from above now descended into the chambers below, bearing gifts that dripped with both gold and sin. The victors, still streaked with sweat and gore, were crowned with laurels and offered their reward, nights of celebration sanctioned by the very rulers who had ordered their suffering. But this reward was not freedom. It was a trap designed to remind them that even glory had a master. The empire granted pleasure as another form of control, intoxication, luxury, and the illusion of power. Around them, tables overflowed with wine, roasted meat, and laughter that could barely mask the emptiness. And in the shadows stood the captives, women chosen from the pens beneath the arena, their faces lit only by torchlight. They were the final gifts, the living spoils of victory. Rome called it honor. History remembers it as corruption dressed in gold. What happens when cruelty becomes ritual, and ritual becomes law? After each grand spectacle, an unspoken ceremony took place, a companion offering. The most triumphant gladiators, often celebrated like demigods, were given women as tokens of the empire's gratitude. To refuse was to risk the emperor's displeasure. To accept was to descend into moral ruin. These encounters were paraded as symbols of virility and strength, but beneath the surface they were structured cruelty. Guards would drag the chosen women into candlelit chambers where wine and music masked their terror. The victors, surrounded by nobles and priests, were told it was divine will, that the gods demanded pleasure after battle. In truth, it was Rome's way of feeding both spectacle and appetite. The women were never named in the records, their existence reduced to whispers, their deaths buried beneath the arena's sand. For some gladiators, the horror of these nights shattered what little humanity they had left. Others drowned in denial, clinging to the empire's lie that they had earned this privilege. And so, the line between conqueror and captive disappeared, both imprisoned by the same empire, bound by different chains. The companion offerings were not gifts, they were sacrifices. How does a civilization call itself great when it builds its glory on suffering it refuses to name? In the days that followed the games, the Colosseum stood empty, its corridors echoing with silence that smelled of iron and rot. The captives who survived were sent back into darkness, their wounds hidden behind thick walls. Their stories never left those tunnels. Roman poets sang of honor and valor, of the divine beauty of combat. None wrote of the sobbing that filled the chambers after the feasts, or the bodies carried quietly into the night. The empire's historians spoke of victory, never of what victory cost. The hypocrisy was staggering. Rome praised its gladiators as heroes of the people, while treating those they destroyed as invisible. Even the victors, celebrated in bronze, knew the truth. Their triumphs were chained to cruelty, and when the emperors stood before the crowds, they proclaimed Rome's moral greatness, calling the games a reflection of divine justice. But beneath their sandals lay the bones of the silenced, their blood still seeping into the foundations of the city they called eternal. The women who endured the hidden price were not merely forgotten, they were erased by design, so the empire's image could remain pure in the eyes of history. Yet, centuries later, the silence they left behind still speaks louder than Rome's marble ever could. Who guards the cages when the world outside applauds the cruelty within? Beneath the Colosseum's roaring tears, a different breed of men kept order. Not soldiers, not slaves, but gatekeepers. They were the invisible gears in the empire's engine of entertainment, entrusted with keys, chains, and silence. Their duty was simple: control the flow of life and death. When to open the cages, when to release the beasts, when to extinguish a scream. To the crowd, they didn't exist. To the captives, they were gods, men who decided whether the cell stayed locked or whether sunlight would touch a face one last time. They carried themselves with the pride of importance, but behind their eyes was something else. Rot. Gatekeepers were chosen for loyalty, not compassion. They earned well, fed well, drank better, bribed by merchants, by senators, even by gladiators who wished for favours before a fight. The empire paid them to be indifferent, and they became masters of it. Each held a dozen lives on a ring of iron keys. Each knew that cruelty was currency. When the games began, they stood in the shadows of the gates, listening, waiting. When it was over, they washed blood from the floors. Between those moments, they laughed, gambled, and traded whispers about who might not survive the next round. The gatekeepers did not kill. They simply opened the doors and looked away. What happens to a man when power over suffering becomes his daily wage? One gatekeeper, known only as Marcellus, kept a tally on his arm, not of victories, but of how many captives had begged him for mercy. Each mark was a memory, or perhaps a confession. For a few coins he could delay an execution, smuggle a letter, even replace one captive with another. Every act of mercy carried a price, and every price was soaked in guilt. Another, a man called Servian, found pleasure in the system's cruelty. He was known to unlock cages early, letting beasts roam too soon just to hear the screams rise before the emperor gave his signal. He told himself it was just work, that Rome needed its spectacles, but his laughter echoed long after the crowd went home. Corruption was not an accident. It was the bloodstream of the games. Gladiators bribed for better weapons, nobles paid for private access to the pens below, and merchants delivered fresh stock from faraway lands. The gatekeepers stood at the centre of it all, the brokers of flesh, the keepers of secrets, and when conscience stirred, it was drowned in wine. In time, they began to believe they were indispensable, that the empire itself would crumble if the gates didn't open on their command. Power had poisoned them, and they mistook obedience for virtue. When cruelty becomes routine, what part of the soul dies first? For years, the gatekeepers moved like ghosts, numb to what they saw, untouched by the cries that filled the tunnels. But numbness is never permanent. It rots slowly, turning into something darker. Some broke under the weight of it. Marcellus, the one who once kept his tally, was found hanging in his cell. The keys that had once ruled others' fates now swinging from his own neck. Others hardened completely, becoming reflections of the cruelty they served. They stopped seeing faces, stopped hearing pleas. The captives became shadows, and shadows do not bleed. The empire rewarded this emptiness. The less a man felt, the longer he survived. Those who hesitated were replaced. Those who obeyed were promoted. Rome did not demand humanity, it demanded function. And so, the gatekeepers became symbols of the system itself, men who could not see right from wrong, because both had been buried beneath the sand. Above them, Rome cheered its victories. Below, the keepers of its gates sank deeper into their own abyss. In the end, they too were captives, chained not by iron, but by indifference. The cages they tended were never truly closed. For every time they turned the key, another door inside themselves locked shut forever. What happens when the truth is too ugly to fit in the pages of history? Rome, with all its marble temples and imperial grandeur, was also a master of silence. The annals of the empire celebrated victories, conquests, and the feats of men, but carefully avoided the shadows that fed its power. The stories of the women who were captured, imprisoned, and exploited beneath the Colosseum rarely survived the scribe's pen. Historians wrote of triumph, not of terror. They chronicled the names of emperors, but not the blood-stained corridors where the captive women waited. Accounts of gladiators' bravery abounded, but the so-called companions of victory were erased, reduced to vague notes about slaves or entertainment extras. Some forbidden texts existed, diaries, letters, and petitions smuggled from the hippodrome's depths, but they were dangerous. To record such truths was to challenge the empire itself. Scribes who dared were censored, exiled, or disappeared altogether. And so, Rome curated its own memory, preserving the facade of civility while hiding the mechanisms of cruelty that made it possible. The grand narrative of civilization was written in gold, while the screams of the captives were buried in ink that time forgot. How can a story survive when its witnesses are silenced? A handful of fragments survived, letters carved into wood, scraps of papyrus hidden in merchant goods, testimonies whispered to sympathetic outsiders. One record tells of a woman from Gaul who documented the names of other captives before being forced into the arena. Another details the hidden networks through which women passed messages, defying their captors in secrecy. These surviving fragments reveal a staggering reality. The women were not passive victims. They resisted, recorded, and tried to preserve their identities against systematic erasure. Each lost page represents a life unacknowledged, a defiance ignored, a pain unrecorded. Yet even these scraps rarely reached the libraries of Rome. They were burned, repurposed, or hidden in private collections where curiosity was punished. The empire's obsession with appearance ensured that the story of suffering would remain invisible, and that the legacy of horror beneath the Colosseum would remain a secret for centuries. Even today, historians piece together these testimonies like a shattered mirror, attempting to reconstruct what Rome tried so hard to erase, and each fragment, no matter how small, challenges the sanitized myth of empire. Can stone speak when history refuses to listen? Beneath Rome, in the hypogeum and surrounding ruins, archaeology has whispered truths that ink and scrolls could not. Stains of blood still linger in the tunnels beneath the Colosseum. Chains, locks, and implements of restraint tell of an industry of suffering. In the ruins of villas and hidden chambers, inscriptions carved into walls hint at women's names, warnings, and silent protests. Artifacts challenge the official narrative of a cultured, orderly empire. Roman coins, jewelry, and personal objects found in burial pits of the oppressed reveal theft, coercion, and trafficking. Temple walls depict the grandeur above, while beneath them lie the tools of exploitation, often ignored by art historians. Even mosaics sometimes tell a darker story. Scenes of victory may glorify gladiators, but subtle details, distressed figures at the margins, shadows of observers in anguish, betray what Rome attempted to erase. These are the ghosts of the lost testimonies, immortalized in stone when ink and parchment failed. The Library of the Lost is not a single place, but a network of memory, hidden scrolls, burnt archives, and relics beneath the city that testify to the human cost of spectacle. And though the empire sought to silence them, archaeology has become their voice, proving that beneath Rome's marble perfection, horror thrived, deliberate, systemic, and all but erased. What is left when the voices of the oppressed are erased from memory? Rome's empire rose on conquest, law, and spectacle. Its streets gleamed with marble, its arenas sang with cheers. Yet beneath the grandeur, beneath the official records, a void persisted, one filled not with words but with absence. The women who had suffered, who had been exploited and silenced, were erased from the historical narrative. They became phantoms, invisible to the chroniclers who celebrated victory and power. Every scroll that recorded triumph, every statue that glorified emperors and generals, carried a silence within its shadow. The horror beneath the Colosseum was not forgotten. It was deliberately hidden. Pain became invisible. Voices drowned by rhetoric of glory and civilization. This calculated void, the empire's deliberate choice to remove the evidence of its cruelty, shaped how history would remember Rome. Civilization was praised, while its foundation of exploitation remained unspoken. The suffering of women became a footnote, a shadow in the margins of memory. Even today, historians struggle to piece together the lives of those who were never meant to survive the record. Their absence is itself a testament, a proof of the deliberate machinery that erased both identity and story. History's silence is deafening, and in that void lies the truth Rome could not tolerate, that its greatness was inseparable from cruelty, and that its myth of civilization depended on those who were never allowed to be seen. Does the machinery of oppression ever truly vanish, or does it simply evolve? The calculated cruelty of Rome finds echoes in modern systems, in institutions that claim civility while exploiting the powerless. Human trafficking, forced labour, and the commodification of women in war zones and criminal enterprises are all distant relatives of the empire's spectacles. Like Rome, contemporary societies often hide these horrors behind facades of legality or morality. Records are sanitized. Victims remain silent. Those in power reward complicity, ignoring suffering in exchange for profit or pleasure. The lessons of history, suppressed in the past, continue to manifest in the present. And yet, just as archaeology has revealed the truth beneath the Colosseum, investigative journalists, advocates, and survivors fight to illuminate the shadows. They attempt to fill the void, to restore humanity to those whom society would rather forget. The struggle against erasure is ongoing, and the echoes of Rome's cruelty remind us that power unchecked inevitably devours the vulnerable. The empire's legacy is not simply ancient, it is structural. Its methods of silencing, controlling, and exploiting endure. What remains invisible to the majority is still visible to those willing to look. The silent witnesses, the survivors, and the evidence buried beneath layers of time and social indifference. If the past is buried, does it vanish? Or does it wait beneath the sand, whispering? The women of the Colosseum's hypogeum left no names in stone, no epics in verse. Yet their suffering is not lost. It exists in the cracks of history, in the archaeological stains, in the fragments of letters burned and hidden. Memory may fade, but truth endures. The empire's calculated void cannot erase the human cost. For every arena that applauded blood, for every emperor who celebrated conquest, there are shadows that survived. The silence of history is a reminder, not a verdict. Even now, when modern cities rise on the bones of old empires, we are haunted by what was hidden. The legacy of exploitation, of the invisible suffering required to build civilization, challenges the stories we tell ourselves about power, progress, and glory. And so, the story closes not with triumph, but with reflection. The sand of the arena may have been swept, but it carries the imprint of every life crushed beneath the spectacle. The Colosseum may now be a tourist attraction, but it whispers a warning. Greatness built on silence is always haunted. We cannot reclaim what was lost, but we can remember. We can listen to the echoes. We can honor the invisible, the erased, the silenced. And in that act of remembrance, the truth survives, stronger than marble, louder than gold, and more enduring than empire itself. The story of Rome's cruelty and the silenced women beneath the Colosseum is complete, a chronicle of horror, erasure, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be forgotten.